let's now take you straight to Moscow, where Xi Jinping landed earlier this week for a two-day visit. On his itinerary was a meet-and-greet session with the Russian President Vladimir Putin and a round of formal talks. This was Xi's first visit to Russia since the start of the Ukraine war. Also, his first trip outside China since securing a third term in office. Of course, the visit was a symbolic show of support for Putin, an important show of support. It was also an attempt to show the world that Xi Jinping is ready to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia or anybody else, that is ready to play peacemaker. And it's a larger stature. It's not just about China being a nuisance or threatening its neighbors or threatening war on Taiwan. China now wants to play a bigger role, and it can play a bigger role. The visit was about sending a message to countries around the world that Xi Jinping will now be playing, or at least will be trying to play, a global role. The 69-year-old president has all the support he needs from inside China, whether they like it or not. He's just been formally re-elected for a historic third term. And on the same day that his third term was given a formal approval, a very strategically timed announcement was made by a country thousands of miles away from China, from Saudi Arabia. And I'm just going to be talking about this story for a couple of minutes before I come back to those images of Russia and China, of Xi Jinping symbolically, literally, figuratively towering over Vladimir Putin and what the implications of that are. Before I go into that in more detail, I do want to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and about Iran. So returning to Saudi Arabia, Riyadh put out this particular Gazette notification. It read, and I'm quoting here, in response to the noble initiative of His Excellency President Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China's support for developing good neighborly relations between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and based on the agreement between His Excellency President Xi Jinping and the leaderships in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, whereby the People's Republic of China would host and sponsor talks between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, proceeding from their shared desire to resolve the disagreement between them, so on and so forth. Very clear. Attempts are being made to get Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and those attempts seem to have been successful. At least the immediate hostility has been ratcheted down. But the highlight of this for the rest of the world is, look who the person is who's doing it. It is China. Saudi Arabia and Iran trying to become friends again, or if not friends, at least stop being enemies again. The two countries will be reopening embassies, they'll be establishing ties, they'll be inking perhaps a security agreement. But it's all thanks to Beijing, to China. Saudi Arabia and Iran, incidentally, had broken off ties in 2016. This was after protesters invaded Saudi posts in Iran. Why? Because Riyadh had executed a prominent Shia scholar. Now, China is going to be putting out a message that, hey, we put an end to the Cold War between these two countries. Analysts were left asking, how is it possible? How did China suddenly play a role? Because Saudi Arabia, let's face it, has always historically been very close to America. The equation has been simple. America buys energy from the Saudis, and it provides weapons and security in exchange. And there's been all sorts of implications of that. In fact, everyone was talking about the fact that maybe America is now going to take the Abraham Accords forward, try and push for closer relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. America till now has really been the titan, the peacemaker, the all-important power in the Middle East. And now, what's happening out here? Saudi Arabia, visibly coming closer to China, which at least appears to be telling the world that it is trying to bring together the Arab world, which is a domain that the US is really likely to pay a diplomat in. The Abraham Accords, which I was just talking about a couple of seconds ago, were just one of the many examples of America playing peacemaker. But let's remember, those accords are now almost 3 years old. And the sands of the West Asian landscape are shifting once again. And this time the wind appears to be blowing in the direction of Beijing. It helped in this case, of course, that Iran was a big player, and America has absolutely no leverage on Iran. So to that extent, China's attempts to play global peacemaker are not necessarily at the cost of America. America can always say, this was a peace deal we couldn't have done, only China could have played that role. And to some extent, What's happening right now between China and Russia is somewhat similar. Obviously, there's no relationship right now between the West and Russia. The West cannot try and play mediator or peacemaker between Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't have the locus standi. It is actively backing one side of it. So who else can? G20, perhaps. And that's something that India would have liked, especially because India is the president of G20. Maybe India would like to have been seen as one of the countries leading to some sort of a peace effort in Ukraine as the president of G20. But now, that is now in question. Because, let's return to that visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow. Among the many statements that came out of here, between the declarations of friendship between China and Russia, which are enough reasons to have some concern, there were some specific statements that would make New Delhi very, very uncomfortable. There was talk about criticizing the Indo-Pacific, saying that the Indo-Pacific is not a good concept. That worries India because it's strategically very important for India. And second, a direct statement made there by Russia and by China saying that there should be no question of G20 having anything to say on Ukraine. And that's a problem for India because it is bound to come up at the G20 summit a little later in the year. So what exactly is happening out here? What are the implications of Russia, China, and this close partnership or friendship, or call it what you will, and what are going to be the implications for India? And to try and understand what exactly is happening there between China and Russia, we're now being joined by Vikram, who's the former German ambassador to China and to Japan. He's also a senior distinguished fellow as the SWP, which is the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us, Herr Volkel. Just wanted to understand, what do you make of the recent overtures that China has been making? It's almost trying to position itself as the peacemaker of the world, which is somewhat ironic considering what else China has been doing. It's now flying to Russia, earlier trying to broker some sort of a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, had some success on that. How do you interpret all of this?
Well, to put it ironically, a peacemaker, if you use that term, then I'd say a peacemaker who doesn't manage to make peace. But leaving irony aside, I think this has to be understood very much in terms of Xi Jinping's personality. You know, he himself was fairly weakened due to his zero COVID policy in China. And there were doubts across the country, as you could see at the end of last year during the protests all over the country, all of a sudden, surprise to everybody, that he has not gained in popularity by his policy. And as China is in a weak position anyway, I mean, mainly economically, but increasing doubts were observable worldwide, whether China would still be able to play a role as before the COVID pandemic, that is a coming world power. I think Xi Jinping understood this also as doubts about his own personal standing in the country and in the world. So what he's trying to show now is that he himself, with China, of course, is coming back to the world stage with a vengeance. He's showing at every possible area that he is really in control of things. Look at the visit to Moscow. I mean, to go for 3 days on such a visit, that is extraordinary. It is a signal. And you said peacemaker, probably you allude to the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, mediated by the Chinese. That, of course, is also a symbol. I mean, the two countries are far from having really resolved their problems with each other, but it serves both sides' interests to re-establish diplomatic relations. Now, China used that opportunity, and it showed at the same time to the world, and mainly that is to the great rival, to the US, that it also may play a big role in the Middle East, which it hasn't done so far.
So let's now look at both of those in some detail. The trip to Russia first. China is not necessarily seen as a neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine, so it's not that China is going to be able to play peacemaker out there. But it appears to many people that there's a very strong axis that is now developing between Russia and China? And is that something that you're seeing as well? Are the two of them really going to start operating in a very close and in a very synergistic manner in the global stage? And is that a very big risk to the existing global order?
Axis, I think, is well-chosen term. But an axis where one wheel is the bigger one and the other wheel is a much smaller one. Because Putin has already weakened his country in its relationship with China. And whatever the outcome of the war will be, he will be weakened. Because let's assume he succeeds in Ukraine, at the same time, he will still be an outcast internationally. And that, of course, has an enormous impact on Russia's economic situation. So he will depend in a much greater degree than so far on China. And China's already been showing that it is ready to step in. The economic relations have been very profitable for China over the past year. If Putin, however, is weakened, as I think a majority of people in the world assume at this time, at the end of this war, then he will be in even more desperate straits in his relationship with China. And he will be totally a client state of China, which serves Chinese interests well. And that is why Xi Jinping went to such great pains in traveling to Moscow now and reassuring Putin that in the end, we are on your side. We're not fully your ally. We're not yet delivering weapons, but you can count on us. Limitless friendship.
So when you're looking at where and how far this could extend, many in the West sound rather scared about the fact that you have China and Russia and potentially Iran, which also may feel that it owes China a little bit, having de-escalated tensions with Saudi Arabia to some level. You can throw Iran into the mix as well. So there's a reasonably formidable alliance of interests which are broadly anti-Western, and they're all coming together.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is a scenario that is very serious, and it does not concern the West alone. It concerns the world as such, the world as it was organized after the Second World War, which is a multilateralist system, the UN system, where countries on more or less equal footing try to sort out their problems together. Think of things like the climate conference, now the water conference, and of course, more important, even more important things such as human rights in many countries. So the world is built on the principle of sovereign states cooperating in resolving their problems. Now, if you get a world that is dominated, not necessarily dominated, but influenced, impacted to a large degree by countries that have an imperial kind of mindset, that are working to increase their own influence even by military means, such as Russia now, of course, China too, and Iran. Well, that has not yet happened, that Iran has gone to war, but you may compare it in its mindset. If you have a world impacted by such countries, then you have what we call a multipolar world, where each pole is free, at liberty, to pursue its own interests, even with military means. And that would weaken mainly, let's say, medium-sized countries such as European countries, but the majority of the countries in the world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America too.
So let's just come to Europe in detail if we can, because in the Indo-Pacific or the Pacific side, at least there are signs, there's some sort of alliances and groupings coming together, which could perhaps take on or confront or contain China in that part of the world, whether it's AUKUS or Quad or anything else. What's Europe's position in all of this? Because sometimes there have been questions about what is going to be the approach of countries like Germany, for example, or other countries in Western Europe, because they do have close relations, or at least a certain dependency on China in some way. They also have certain relations with Russia, which date back to some time. So which way do you think Europe is going to go in this new world order that seems to be emerging?
That's a big question. I'll try to give two answers. One is that Europe certainly has amazed many in the world, many observers, by the unity it has shown after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think that was unexpected, and honestly speaking, unexpected to many Europeans as well. But the way we have allied ourselves with the US and the majority in the General Assembly of the United Nations showed that there is still the strength of Europe existing, which is strength in unity. That's one side. And I think we're working quite well on that side of the coin. The other side is that we're not sure how long this can last, because we are impacted more than most countries in the world by the effects of the return effects, the echo effects of the sanctions policies, because we were had a very close relationship economically with Russia, not only in the energy sector, in many industrial areas as well. And this is something that is lacking now. Of course, this impacts negatively our own economic development. How long can that last? If there is a crisis here or there, maybe even a recession, how will people then think about the war in Ukraine? And will we be able to hold together the way we are doing now? Now, as you know, we just have the European Council going on today. And this is certainly one of the problems the heads of state and government of Europe will be looking at.
No, I guess you're right. And for a country like India, of course, this is a particularly strange sort of a development and a worrying development, because historically, Russia has been an ally of India. China has been anything but a friend and enemy, if anything. And China does have another client state, which is Pakistan. So that particular axis is already inimical to India. So a lot of people are quite uncomfortable in India that what happens if Russia, this great ally of India, now ends up becoming a client state of China as well. What does that mean for India? What does it mean for this part of the world and for its security?
Well, I'm the last to say a word about India, except from the position of a faraway observer. But let me say, understanding the conundrum China's in presently led me early on to the question why India doesn't use its position as the chair of the G20 to try to mediate. Because of the situation that you have just described, isn't India in a position where it is somewhere between the various sides for obvious reasons, for its own interests, like the old alliance with Russia, like its little bit tenuous relationship with China, but also with a flowering relationship to other countries in Asia and even the United States? Wouldn't it, as the G20 chair, be in a position where it could try with some hope for success to mediate between the different sides? It has not tried that yet, but I think that would be commensurate to India's standing.
You know, that's a really excellent and an interesting idea, and I'm sure the Indian government is thinking about it. Although I know that both Russia and China said in their statement, we would not like the G20 to step into whatever's happening in Ukraine. They said that really, really clearly, and we know where they're coming from. But India trying to intervene could be an interesting idea. Close relations with Russia, potentially seen as a viable mediator by Ukraine as well. But I'm not very sure that there is a solution anyway. At least on this program, the last few weeks and months, if you talk to anybody on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, there seems to be absolutely no meeting ground. So there may be people somewhat concerned to say, well, we can try mediation, but I'm not very sure whether there's going to be a solution. I guess you could argue that at least you're seen to be trying.
Others are trying, like Erdogan in Turkey.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, diplomacy is a wide open field. You never know where negotiations end once you start them, and it may come to a productive end. And yes, you're right. At the present situation, I think Zelensky has just said yesterday, was it, or this morning even, that at the present time, there is no space for negotiations because what Russia set out as its position was exactly the same as in February of last year. So that, of course, is no common ground to start talks, but that may change even tomorrow.
All right, Herr Walker, thank you so much for joining us with that. All right, let's now turn a little bit to the India angle. Xi Jinping has clearly not shied away from telling his country that China should, quote, actively participate in the reform and construction of the global governance system. Xi has also gone on to say China should add what he called positive energy to world peace and development. In other words, what Xi is trying to say is that going forward, you should be prepared for more diplomatic coups. You should be prepared for China trying to stride the global stage as a peacemaker. Now, obviously, India is going to be scratching his head and figuring out what all of that means, because in this part of the world, China is anything but a peacemaker, quite the opposite. So far, India's China headaches have been fairly extensive. What China is doing on the line of actual control, what it's doing in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, what it's doing in Arunachal Pradesh, what it's doing in the Indian Ocean, and of course, Beijing's support to Pakistan, which has essentially become a client state sometime back. That's been India's major headache. This headache, these questions that are now arising, are in some ways slightly more serious, because if you look at India's strategic autonomy, and all experts have been talking about this fairly extensively in the last few days, India's strategic autonomy, let's have a multipolar world, let's have the West can be one pole and we are reasonably friendly with them, India should be another pole, maybe you can have Russia as another pole, China will be a pole. It's a multipolar world and India has a certain strategic autonomy, and that's at least been the belief till now, and it's been a great goal for India to strive towards. But what happens to all of those concepts of strategic autonomy if one of India's greatest allies and supporters all these decades, Russia in other words, now becomes a junior partner or a client state in some manner to China? Because China, let's be clear, whatever else you may think about the world, there are very few possibilities or scenarios where China is going to be a friendly power to India. The China question is always going to be India's #1 challenge, #1 threat. Let's underline that. That is the reality. So when India navigates the world, keeping that China factor in mind, what happens to India's strategic autonomy? What are the adjustments that India will now have to make in light of what has just happened in Moscow between Russia and China? Well, let's throw that question to a really key person who's been watching all of this and analyzing this very closely, Professor Harsh Pant, who's the Vice President of Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. He's also a professor at the King's College in London, been really analyzing this entire area in some great detail. Professor Pant, you've been writing extensively about the Indo-Pacific and how important it is for India's security. And now suddenly we're having one of our closest strategic allies, Russia, joining China in saying that the Indo-Pacific is a bad concept. What does that mean for India?
Well, Vikram, first of all, it reflects how, in terms of the global discourse, it's strange, but Russia and China seem to be the only two countries that believe that it is a bad concept, that it does not really reflect the needs of our times. So in some ways, Indo-Pacific has become a means through which the larger world, and India included here, has been able to isolate China and Russia. Now, the other aspect is what it means. I think it has a very, very important meaning for India, because for a very long time we have been deluding ourselves into believing that eventually we will be able to bring Russia on board as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. There are many in India who have argued that, look, Russia is also an Indo-Pacific country. If only we keep the channels of communication open, we will be able to handle Russia's concerns and we will be able to bring Russia on board. Now, clearly that is not happening. Clearly, we have seen the kind of relationship that is developing between China and Russia is of a different order, and where Putin looks like a pygmy in terms of literally and figuratively, because you have a relationship where China is the dominant player. It is calling all the shots, and it has been able to convince Russia that Indo-Pacific, that anything to do with the Indo-Pacific, that its partnerships in the wider Indo-Pacific are irrelevant. It has to follow the strategic logic that China wants it to follow. And this is something that will have a fundamentally transformative effect on India, whether we like to believe it or not. And because for the first time, we will have Russia, which is taking a position on a broader geostrategic matter, which is going to be quite in opposition to us, in opposition to what India believes in opposition to what India's strategic interests are. So how do you then configure this relationship that you have been arguing is historical, it's very important, it's important, but that there's nothing that can do damage to this relationship. So I think we need to start figuring out a response to that bigger problem.
Professor Pant, before we come to the challenges, just help us understand, for people who are not strategic thinkers and are not experts in international relations, they're sometimes wondering what's the big deal about Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific, and what is the relevance of these concepts and terms, and why does it matter if you're talking about Indo-Pacific and not Asia-Pacific? Just help us understand that in words of one syllable.
Every geography that we create is an imagined geography, and I think for a very long time the world had believed, and this is largely the major players in world politics, and in particular the US, that they can divide Asia into two distinct groups. So if you see the way State Department was organized in the past, if you see the way policy documents were written, they would say South Asia and Asia Pacific, as if these are two distinct entities where South Asia exists as a microcosm, and Asia Pacific is the real deal. So India was never seen as part of the wider Asian landscape, and I think that has been India's problem throughout its post-independent history, that India had been made marginal by others. And I think now what is happening is that as the balance of power is changing, thanks to China, the world is realizing that it is no longer possible to view Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans as two distinct maritime zones. So instead, you have to look at this as one contiguous maritime zone, because only when you do that will you be able to appreciate the magnitude of the change. Will you be able to bring on board the kind of capacities that are needed to shape this security and strategic architecture? And you will be able to respond proactively to this dynamic. And that's why this connection between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean is important. And it is important for India because India stands at the heart of this geography.
All right, I get that then. So the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the reason why it's strategically so crucial for India is India doesn't get boxed into South Asia. There's India and there's Pakistan, Afghanistan, a few other countries there in South Asia. Indo-Pacific, and suddenly India is a central pillar of that, and therefore a very big global player. That, you're saying, is the importance of the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, Russia going along with China and saying, we don't believe in the Indo-Pacific and it's irrelevant, what happens then? What happens to India in that? Because let's face it, there's another challenge. G20 presidency is with India, and now Russia's also joined China in saying, don't even raise Ukraine out there. So India's challenges have become that much more difficult this week.
Yes, and I think on the G20 issue, we have already seen that challenge manifests itself at the finance ministers meeting and foreign ministers meeting, where we could not come out with a joint communique. Now, when you look at this Russia question is important and interesting for India, because for a very long time, as we were discussing earlier, India and Russia had been on the same page. We have had the same views on largely how the world was evolving, how we wanted to position ourselves. We wanted a multipolar world. They wanted a multipolar world. But primarily, I think their desire was to shape a post-American world order in which Russia played an important role. Now, what has happened is that while India has moved in the interstate hierarchy, Russia has gone down. So Russia's ability to shape that post-American world order is becoming very, very restricted and constricted. And in that space, China has filled that vacuum. China has become the dominant player. And as Russian and especially Putin's foreign policy has become anti-Western, India has also become marginal. Look, because India's relationship is very important. For India, its relations with the West are important. Its relations with Russia are important, primarily because of the China factor. Our most important strategic challenge is China. And India is perhaps the only country that, while it needs Russia in the short term to manage China because of the defense engagement, it needs West to manage China in the long term. So you have a very distinct way in which India is looking at the world, whereas Russia, because it has been losing one advantage after another, and it is not playing any more of an economic role in world politics. And by I think invading Ukraine, it is also taken a position which has been detrimental to its larger strategic interests, whatever Mr. Putin might say today. The fact is that that has brought Russia to a level where the world and I think many in Russia are also looking at the spectacle of how Russia has become almost a vassal state of China, almost a junior partner, which is very visible. And I think therefore they are dictated by how the Chinese are viewing the world. They have very few options. And therefore, when the Chinese say we don't want anything to do with Indo-Pacific, they have to follow it through because they have a larger challenge in Eurasia vis-a-vis the West, which they are more bothered about.
So look, in India's case, at least from many strategic thinkers, feel that India would ideally like a multipolar world. India would like to have a multipolar world where it has strategic autonomy. Now, it's not as if India doesn't have squabbles with the West. India constantly keeps on arguing with the West in many ways. Look what's been unfolding with Britain, for example, in the last couple of days. But India now seems to be confronting a situation where you've got China, the big threat and the big enemy. You already got Pakistan as the client state of China, and now Russia, who's been India's strategic ally, potentially also becoming a junior partner, if not a client state of China. In your view, if that is really the situation, does India have no choice but to start looking for closer and closer ties with the West?
I think so. I think some of the more, some of the debates that we have been having, and they are very relevant debates in terms of how Russia matters to us. It matters in the Eurasian context. We still need security as far as our northern border is concerned, northern periphery is concerned, where the entire Central Asian belt is very important for us. The whole extremism, terrorism threat that emanates from there continues to impact on India. So if you recall, after the Americans left Afghanistan, there was visible engagement between India and Russia to ensure that we are on the same page as to what is happening in Central Asia and Afghanistan. So there are enormous interests there apart from defense that brings us together. But I think the broader strategic choices are becoming sharper and sharper. You really cannot fudge it anymore. And the more Russians and the Chinese come together, the more consolidated they become. I think Indian choices will have to become more explicit. And they are, I think, this brings us into this space where we are increasingly looking at a world that for India, I think is fundamentally, this is a fundamentally transformative moment. I would go so far as to say that I think the kind of structural realities that we faced in early 1990s with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, it's very likely that we are moving to a point where Russia-China consolidation poses us the similar kind of a structural challenge, whether that means enhancing our relations with the West, or to what extent we want to go with the West, or whether it means developing our own capacities. That's a question for Indian policymakers to answer, but perhaps a combination of both will be needed.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying building India's own capacity is, of course, a desirable outcome, and it must be done. But it could take some time for that to happen. Now, you're saying this week has been a fundamentally transformative fact, the fact that China and Russia are consolidating in this manner. And that means that at least in the short term or the medium term, India will have to look very closely at that relationship and therefore reassess its ties with the West and say, at least for a moment, there's no alternative but to have really close ties with the West. Is that what you're saying?
I think India will have to look at it. India will have to also reevaluate how far we can keep on arguing that Russia is a very valuable partner. It is a valuable partner, but what are the limits of that partnership? We have not seen that debate in public space in India with the kind of vigor that perhaps is needed at this particular moment.
All right, Professor Pant, we hear you loud and clear. Have a debate around the importance of Russia as a partner. Do the first step in that, start talking about it and keep that debate running. Ask what happens if Russia, one of India's closest strategic allies, essentially becomes a Chinese junior partner. What happens to India's strategic autonomy? What happens to India's options? Thank you, Professor Pant, for joining us, and we will keep on having a debate around that. Right, now it's going to be really interesting to see what length Xi Jinping goes to get an image facelift. The Chinese president is desperately trying to go from being the face of wolf warrior diplomacy to the face of global peace. Trust me, the irony is not lost on me. And quite frankly, what's going to matter is not his words or his trips to Moscow. What is going to really count is what he does next. What does he do on the line of actual control? What does he do with Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh? What did he do with his other neighbors? What does China do in the South China Sea? What does China do with Japan? What does China do with Taiwan? At the end of the day, China's actions are going to be far more important than China's words. And if China wants to be seen as a force for good and a force for peace, then it really has to reevaluate the way it's behaving with its neighbors, with its citizens too, but certainly with its neighbors. All right, on that note, let's now turn our attention to a country that many also call China's puppet or China's client state, and another country that has been a perennial headache for India. And of course, I'm talking about Pakistan. This country continues to implode. It's now heading yet again towards default. And yeah, I know you've heard me saying Pakistan heading for default for a long time, but it's been continuing. Now, Pakistan needs to pay international lenders billions and billions of dollars over the next 3.5 years. That's the figure out there. That's the amount it has to repay its creditors. But Islamabad only has $3 billion left in forex reserves. What happens in the next 3.5 years is anybody's guess. What we can tell you, though, is Pakistan's friends from the Muslim world who have been holding its back, supporting Pakistan for a long period of time, they are now slowly but surely starting to abandon Islamabad. Earlier this week, we learned that Saudi Arabia has decided not to provide Islamabad with any interest-free loans. Now, if this was not bad enough, you should listen to what else has happened this week. Kuwait asked Pakistan to start paying for the diesel it imports for the Gulf country. Wouldn't it not pay it before? Yeah, of course it would, but not up front. You see, in 2000, Pakistan and Kuwait struck a deal. This deal extended a credit line facility to Pakistan, allowing it to import diesel from Kuwait and pay the Gulf country later in installments. 23 years later, Kuwait has changed its mind, or you could say reality has caught up with it. Kuwait is now asking Pakistan for cash up front if it wants to buy diesel, and it doesn't stop there. Kuwait also wants Islamabad to clear previous dues as soon as possible. And how many dues are we talking about? Well, the amount runs into millions and millions of dollars, a minimum of $120 million. It could be more. Where will Pakistan get that kind of money from? Earlier this week, there are reports that Pakistan has managed to betray its all-weather friend China by sending some weapons to Ukraine. These reports were published around the same time that Xi was in Moscow. Now, China may well still bail Pakistan out, but that, of course, is the last straw that Pakistan is clutching on. China, bail us out, help us out. Now, what about the International Monetary Fund? Earlier this week, there were whispers that the IMF had attached nuclear program-related strings to the bailout package. The Washington-based lender then went on to deny this, as did Pakistan's Finance Minister Ishaq Dar, which led some analysts to point out that the very fact that the IMF was categorically refuting the nuclear angle only means there must have been some fire for that smoke. Now, there's been a major delay in the IMF bailout that Pakistan has been banking on for a while now. $1.1 billion is what Pakistan is expecting from the IMF. Those funds are part of the $6.5 billion bailout package that the IMF had approved in 2019. This $1.1 billion tranche was supposed to have been dispersed in November 2022. It's now March 2023, and there's no money in sight. The only thing that you can see are friends walking away from what's looking like a collapsing country. And if all of this wasn't bad enough, what are the actual headlines and the pictures that are coming from Pakistan? Is there concerted action to try and do something about the economic situation? Try and solve the crisis that is upon Pakistan. Talk to friends, talk to allies, even talk to enemies. Try and do something to save yourself from imminent bankruptcy. Is that what Pakistan is worrying about? No. These are the pictures. These are the images. These are the headlines. Let's try and arrest Imran Khan. Let's try and figure out a solution politically as to what the crisis is there. Let's have protests on the street. Let's have drama. Let's have massive headlines coming across political instability. Anybody looking at this entire situation would be baffled, would be scratching their head, and would be saying, what exactly is Pakistan up to? And to try and understand what exactly is happening in Pakistan, we're now being joined by Dr. Jamil Khan, who's been ambassador of Pakistan to Malta, to Libya, and to the UAE. Dr. Khan, thank you so much for joining us. You know, when people are looking at the situation in Pakistan, on the one hand, There's movement towards a default. You've got close allies of Pakistan for decades, like Saudi Arabia, saying, we're not going to give you any more interest-free loans. You've got Kuwait saying, we're not going to give you diesel. And yet, all the attention in Pakistan seems to be on political dramas and what's happening with Imran Khan. What is happening?
That's right. In fact, we have a political instability. There is no doubt about it. And the concerned leadership of various parties, they're going to have their multi-party conference to discuss and decide how to approach this political instability. We have changed. We have seen a little change in the attitude of the opposition party, which is Imran Khan and which is PTI, just about 3-4 days ago, in which for the first time, PTI chairman Imran Khan has agreed to attend the multi-party conference, and that seems to have broken the ice. And in the coming few hours and few days, I expect that this move might as well pave the way to bring the heat a little down on the political instability, which is causing economic issues also to the country. So that might as well start straightening up in the coming days, if not weeks.
Look, Dr. Khan, I have absolutely no doubts. Yeah, Imran Khan may be doing his bit and he's being intransigent and he's also whipping up sentiments. All of that is fine. But if you're looking at it from the point of view of the government of Pakistan and by the people who are running the country, you have to ask whether this is really the time to try and arrest Imran Khan or to have a political crisis, or should the government not be trying to bring the heat down a little bit on political instability and try and solve the economic issues that are bringing the country to the brink of default, on the brink of bankruptcy?
Once it comes to the law of the land, in a country like ours and in this region, or even in some other regions of the world, there are some political motivation behind certain cases, but there are cases which are very genuine as well. Now, that is up to the court to decide about it. But getting arrested by a political leader, as in India, Pakistan, and in any of these countries, including the West. Now, Trump is all set for facing the prosecution. Whether he's arrested or not is a different thing. So I think the political leaders should not really, and they have the platform available. Imran Khan, the chairman of the PTI, has been given relief by the courts, and genuinely, I would say that. And then even if he's arrested, not a big deal. All other political leaders in this country and elsewhere, from time to time, they have faced the prosecution. So that to me is not a very big deal. But yes, how much turmoil, how much problem does it cause succeeding the arrest? That is a different thing.
Look, Dr. Jamil, you're right. It does happen in a multitude of countries and in South Asia. I mean, even in India, you're having the opposition today going to the High Court, to the Supreme Court and saying, look what's happening and we're being targeted. So political instability happens. The rule of law is an important question. But India is not in the sort of a situation that Pakistan is. Very few countries are in the sort of an economic crisis that Pakistan is. So that's why, again, I'm coming back to that basic question about whether the focus should not be on trying to solve the economic crisis as opposed to having political drama.
Well, there are about 73 countries at the moment which have been hit directly and which has been impacted and affected around the world post this toxic geopolitical situation. And obviously, the pandemic had already caused huge damage to the economy of these 73 countries. And that is the figure I'm quoting to you, the post G20 and Paris Club meeting. So the Pakistan, yes, there is no doubt that Pakistan should have been able to improve its economy, should have been able to improve its political instability, should have been able to improve so many other aspects which could have really made it really sustainable. Now, having said so, Pakistan has got 500 million just about a couple of days ago, another about tranche from China. Now, IMF negotiation is still going on. Pakistan has met almost all the conditions of IMF, except what you were mentioning in your intro. Perhaps they need some kind of a written undertaking by the friendly countries who have been bailing out in past and who are all lined up to bail out, including Saudi Arabia and UAE. My own understanding about the current development is that since IMF has now almost finalized the staff level negotiation, and Saudi Arabia has recently reset, like United States has reset its foreign policy, Saudi Arabia has also reset its foreign policy. Very recently, they have not been able to give the loan the way they've been giving to Jordan, to Egypt, and to so many other countries, including Turkey. What they have asked is that interest-free loan probably would be hard for them, and they are now trying to be competitive in terms of the world creditors, and they want to toe that same line. And Pakistan should not shy away with that. If there is some interest levied on that, whatever loan is the Saudi Arabia is going to give. In fact, 3 billion plus one, they had already given their inclination about it. So that seems to be just again coming very shortly, and all these things are going to materialize. And by the way, there are a lot of talks about this problem of economy in Pakistan. There's so many countries are sailing in the same boat. Our neighboring country, your neighboring country, bordering country, Sri Lanka, has started now improving its issue of economy. They have got the first tranche of IMF, and they have brought certain reforms. So Pakistan is no exception. They have to bring in the reform which has been suggested by IMF for their own interest.
Okay, so let's just turn our attention specifically to the economy. We've heard what Saudi Arabia is saying, we've heard what Kuwait is saying, even China expressing a certain amount of reservations in bailing out. We're hearing what the IMF is saying. I'm going to ask you a direct question. If friendly countries are not going to be stepping up to Pakistan's support right now and actually providing a bailout, is there a real risk that Pakistan's going to go bankrupt? We saw Sri Lanka flirting with bankruptcy. Is Pakistan going to go bust very soon?
There are certain economists, they are giving their comments on those lines, but the other group of economists, they feel that Pakistan would sail through with the new reforms which they have just brought in on the suggestion of the IMF. That is one. And secondly, the friendly countries have not refused altogether, and it has never been in the past like that. So it appears that friendly countries, in view of the latest geopolitical development, which happened just about 7-8 days ago, which is Chinese mediation and Iran and Saudi Arabia, again establishing their diplomatic relations. So if we keep that in our mind, and if we keep our SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which India is a member, and China and this entire bloc, in my own view and in my own analysis, I don't think the friendly countries would totally refuse that and drag their feet, because Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, or even UAE, as we all know, the kind of relation we've been maintaining, and in past, the way they've been coming for the rescue of Pakistan, my own analysis is that it's just a matter of just days, if not weeks, that we will have this breakthrough. And my own analysis is that Pakistan, now that the leadership, the government, and the PDM government, they have started tightening their belt, it appears that they would be able to save themselves from that situation.
Right.
So I'm quite affirmative about it, and quite positive that they would be able to pull out of this the problem until the political instability further drags down and further goes down. Then in that case, situation would be precarious.
All right, Dr. Jamil, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective. Right, our final story is now about something that happened 20 years ago, but it's still relevant right now. And I'm speaking about the war in Iraq. Remember 2003, when the United States, shortly after having been attacked with 9/11 and everything which happened with the Twin Towers, we knew that, and the whole world was sympathizing with America, and were also at that point, by the way, saying that the real sources of terrorism are partly in Afghanistan, which is where the Taliban was and Osama bin Laden was, and also Pakistan, quite frankly, was the country that was funding and supporting a lot of that terrorism. What did the United States do? In 2003, it invaded Iraq. And that obviously led to a whole chain of circumstances in Iraq, but it's important for us to turn our attention to that. Because when you are having wars happening in other parts of the world, Ishan Tharoor, for example, right now, wrote just a couple of days back, and I'm sort of putting up his article, he said, how can you really have the United States talking about the morality of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, when 20 years later, the morality of what the United States did in Iraq has not been crystal clear. I'm sort of paraphrasing what he wrote out there, but it's a valid point. The United States did go into Afghanistan, but you could say there was cause for that, there was justification for that. What was the justification to go into Iraq 20 years ago? That is something that we will turn our attention to. But before that, let's just remind you of those events 20 years ago.
The story actually begins in the year 1990. That year, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invades an oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. US responds by asking Hussein to withdraw troops. He refuses. So an US-led coalition decides to bomb strategic Iraqi locations. Back home in the US, President George H.W. Bush says he wants Iraq to be a liberal democracy. You know, much like the US. This triggers years of discourse, with political leaders across America demanding the deposition of Saddam Hussein. Cut to 2002. George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, is now president. America is recovering from the 9/11 attacks. In October that year, Bush Jr. says Saddam Hussein has a massive stockpile of biological weapons, and this stockpile is capable of killing millions. Bush adds, 11 years ago, as a condition for ending the Persian Gulf War, the Iraqi regime was required to destroy its weapons of mass destruction, to seize all development of such weapons, and to stop all support for terrorist groups. The Iraqi regime has violated all of those obligations. It possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons. But Bush has no proof to back his claim. That does not stop the United Nations Security Council from passing a resolution against Iraq. The country is given a final warning, a final opportunity to comply with its disarmament obligations. The UN also asks Iraq to readmit inspectors. Iraq complies to a certain extent. But the UN inspectors fail to find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. This despite carrying out 700 rounds of inspection. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair declare that Iraq is interfering with the inspections. But again, there is no proof. On the 17th of March 2003, Bush issues an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. He is given 48 hours to leave Iraq, the country he rules. Saddam obviously refuses. The US wastes no time in invading Iraq. Attacks begin on the morning of March 20, 2003, changing the fate of Iraq forever. Joining Washington in its bloody war is the United Kingdom. Their end goal is to end the rule of Saddam Hussein. On the 9th of April 2003, US troops seize Baghdad. His statue is raised. Saddam Hussein goes into hiding. On the 1st of May 2003, George Bush appears on aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln off the coast of California to declare victory.
In the Battle of Iraq,
in the months that follow, lawlessness sweeps Iraq. There's looting, violence, rising crime, and a rising guerrilla warfare. But all this while, no weapon of mass destruction is found. There is also no sign of a budding liberal democracy, only mobocracy at best. In December 2003, Saddam Hussein is found. He is bearded, bedraggled, and in a hole near his hometown, Tikrit. He is tried and sentenced to death by hanging. On the 30th of December 2006, Saddam is sent to the gallows. It is the first day of Eid al-Adha, and Saddam dies clinging on to a Quran. A year before Saddam's hanging, an American presidential commission concludes that US intelligence on Iraqi weapon of mass destruction was completely faulty, and there was not one bit of evidence. So what was the massive stockpile Bush was referring to? The UK government's Chilcot report says that intelligence officials knew that the war would cause societal collapse and that it would exacerbate the problem of terrorism. Clearly, Bush and Blair could not care less.
And tonight we now discuss the impact of that history with Colonel Richard Outzen, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, also somebody who served both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Colonel Outzen, thank you so much for joining us. You were in the Kirkuk area, you were in Baghdad, I believe, also in Afghanistan. Looking back 20 years, how do you actually remember those wars and the premises that the Iraq war in particular was fought on?
Well, Vikram, it's great to be with you, so thanks for having me. Like most of the servicemen in the United States that were serving in the 90s and the aughts, this was a formative event, right? And so what I remember leading up to the war was this sense that the world was changing. We had gone from the Cold War paradigm of two great superpowers and entered into a period of great unrest. And we were dealing with terrorism. We were dealing with worries about nuclear proliferation and wondering how the world would be shaped. There was a movement, obviously, in the United States, both on the left and in the right, saying that we should use this newfound power to reshape the world in some fundamentally more just ways. Hubris, I guess, would be one way to describe that. But I remember thinking with a little bit of sort of trepidation also that the exercises of great power for ambitious goals, and this is how it was seen in the United States. I know many other countries thought it was a grab for oil or simple bullying, but in reality, there was a thought in Washington and in the forces that this was an attempt to use asymmetric power that we had sort of fallen into after the fall of the Soviet Union to plant a seed of democracy, to do something to punish a dictator, to do something ideologically ambitious, I suppose. But at the same time, war asks very hard questions of people, right? So like you can have this goal, but have you realistically thought out how long it will take, how it will be opposed, who benefits, who loses, and whether you have the will to sustain it? So I think there was sort of a trepidation within the forces of whether we were equal to the task and whether that task was sustainable. But we also were an unrivaled military power at the time. So I think there was a certain optimism at the outset that the mission could be done.
Well, when you look at the positioning of war, that is interesting. I was just talking about Ishant Tharoor's article, for example. He was writing and comparing what's happening with Ukraine, which is very clearly being positioned as a conflict between right and wrong, between good and evil, between moral and immoral. Now, the two wars that you were talking about, Iraq and Afghanistan, in neither case was the work completely done and completely finished. But if you look back at those wars 20 years later, Iraq is often seen as morally wrong. Why on earth did the US go inside, and why did it lead to an outcome? I mean, it may not have led to a good outcome any more than Afghanistan did, but why did the US go in? Still a big question.
Well, I think that's right. And there are some people in the US that refer surreptitiously to Afghanistan as the good war and Iraq as the bad war. Why? Because we had been attacked on 9/11, and the perpetrators of that attack were Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network. They were being hosted by the Taliban in Afghanistan. We had tried extensively and in good faith, I think, to talk with the Taliban to get Al-Qaeda removed. And after the attacks, I think there was a huge sense in the United States that that was unavoidable. We had to strike back at the people who had caused the death of so many of our countrymen. Iraq, not only was it a very different political situation where we sort of had Saddam in a box, right, because of Operation Northern Watch and Operation Southern Watch, he had been prevented from reprising an aggressive war against his neighbors, which he had tried in Kuwait in 1990 and 91, and frankly with Iran before that. But there was not this sense that this was inevitable, that the Iraqis were going to strike us. So in this sense, it was a war of choice.
You know, Colonel Alsen, I remember being in the United States 20 years ago, and I remember having conversations with any number of analysts from the State Department, Pentagon, anywhere, anybody you asked, and you kept on asking them, why Iraq? Because that's not where the war of terror really originated. That's not where Al-Qaeda is. That's not where Osama bin Laden is. Okay, Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator, he was a terrible person, but that is not where the terror originated. And clearly there were no weapons of mass destruction. So why are you fighting a war in Iraq? There were no clear answers to that. And even today, when you look back at that particular reason, no matter how bad a person Saddam Hussein was, there's no clear reason why that particular war was fought.
I think that's true when we look at it through the cold lens of realism and realpolitik. You know, we throughout the Cold War, we dealt with many bad regimes, so to speak, as long as they were geopolitically not a threat to us, and that there was some advantage to be had by dealing with them. But remember the moment, you know, there was this idea that democracy was converging, this Francis Fukuyama end of history moment that everybody wanted and deserved, free market capitalism and a democratic republic form of government, and that somehow if we just removed the obstacles to those things, that many more people would be living the life that the Europeans and Americans had. So it almost felt like an obligation. Now, that was based on some very wrong suppositions about what Iraqis want, about what the neighbors want, and about what we were capable of doing. But yeah, so I think with the Americans, if you know our history, there is an ideological component to it. We tend to see ourselves either as withdrawn from the world, this sort of isolationist impulse that will take root for decades at a time, and then this crusading impulse, this idea that we are a unique shining city on a hill and that we have a need to share that or spread it throughout the world. And that year, 2003, I think we were still in the grips of that sort of idealism.
You know, Colonel Alsen, the really interesting question, the other war which was also fought in Afghanistan, in many cases you could say, if I can paraphrase you, that was the good war, it was the correct war. It wasn't just a question of the fact that terror originated from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was there. The 9/11 attacks were planned out there. But there were other issues also. The way Taliban treated women, for example, the way they're still treating women. And that perhaps was a war that could have had some justification to stay engaged and to stay engaged for a longer period. And yet, the United States just a couple of years ago withdrew. And many people would say it abandoned the people of Afghanistan to a rather dark fate. And look what has happened out there. Look what's happening to women out there. Look what's happening to girls who can't go to school anymore. So sometimes even a good war can be fought, and then you just lose interest and walk out, and the people there are back to square one.
I think that's right. And so the political logic for war in Afghanistan was stronger in that this was a regime that was, I mean, truly egregious to its own people. They were the public beheadings and the repression of the ethnic minorities and terror support being part of the list. But also the fact that Afghanistan was a country in a deep spiral. They were at the bottom of the UN's Human Development Index. There was no 24-hour electricity, raw sewage in the streets, very few rights. I can tell you from my time there, both in 2009 and 10, and then later in 14 and 15, that at least with regards to Kabul and the other major cities, Afghanistan made a lot of progress during the stage that the United States was there. And women were being educated. The sewage and electricity and basic sort of necessities of life were better at the end of that. It was the country was moving up in terms of human development. Now, in America, people asked the question as the years went on, when does this end? And when is enough enough? And I think, you know, we, in a sense, lost the patience for that. But the logic there for doing it and some of the actual measurements of success, I think, as you say, were there.
You know, Colonel Alsen, you were there as recently as about 2014 and 15. A lot of people were saying that at the time when America left Afghanistan, look, even a single death is bad, obviously, and is wrong, obviously, but it's not as if there were hundreds or thousands of soldiers dying. I think it was 10 or 15 soldiers in a year. So do you think Afghanistan could have been stabilized? Do you think the work that you and many others tried so hard to do in Afghanistan, it could have been taken forward When you look at Afghanistan today and you see what's happening out there, you see what's happening with women and girls, I'm sure you feel a sense of regret, not just for the American soldiers who died out there, but to everybody who died trying to make Afghanistan a better place, and it's gone right back to where it once was.
No, I agree with that. And the question of how many casualties are acceptable, it's an essentially political decision. I disagreed with this one because the U.S. military loses more people to training accidents every year than we were losing on an annualized basis for the last 2 or 3 years of the conflict in Afghanistan. Now, it was costing a fair amount of money, in the billions of dollars, I think $4 or $5 billion a year in direct costs. And of course, the advice from many of the advisors if we believe that what we've read in the press, many of the advisors to the U.S. administration and the Pentagon and elsewhere said this can be done at acceptable cost. So ironically, as we look at these two wars in sort of a related sense, if Iraq was a war of, beginning the war in Iraq was an act of choice and not compulsion, so too was ending the war in Afghanistan. That was an act of choice and not of compulsion.
Right, I think that sums it up, and it's an interesting question because it makes you wonder if the U.S. couldn't have stayed on in Afghanistan and taken the cost and the losses. Is the U.S. ever going to set foot in another place? Now, whether it's a bad war like Iraq or a good war like Afghanistan or anything else, would the U.S. ever do it again? And that's a question that people are asking right now, not just because of what's happening in Ukraine, but what about Taiwan tomorrow? Because if the U.S. didn't have the ability to stay on and take the losses of 10, 15 soldiers for Afghanistan and for the people out there, would the U.S. really go in to defend Taiwan?
Well, I think the U.S. has learned an important lesson in the unilateral exercise of power. And I think warfare is to be regretted at any and all times. In fact, it is soldiers who most regret and resist warfare because we're the ones who suffer and die in it. There's this thinking, though, that in order to prevent war, you have to prepare for it. One of the ways you prepare for it is to work with allies and to have large coalitions. This is why NATO is the most successful military alliance in the history of mankind, at least of those that I'm aware of. It's why in the case of trying to prevent aggression by China, for instance, we're working very closely with Japan and India and Australia and other allies in the region. When we work with allies, we are not only more effective in war, we're more effective at preventing war. And I would argue that in Ukraine, there's been a great solidarity and a great movement to work together with allies and with NATO. I don't think we're going to engage in a massive exercise of unilateral power again, like we did in Iraq. I think that we learned that there's problems of international legitimacy. You'll remember the struggles trying to get UN authorization and justification. The war was not popular in the United States in 2003. There were some protests, and a lot of all the people initially voted for it, including our current President Biden. Within a very short period of time, within 2 to 3 years, it became very clear that the war was not as it had been anticipated. It did not free democratic forces to suddenly spring forth in Iraq. And then the allies that we had not gotten on board in a fundamental way also became very skeptical of it. So I think we've learned a lesson about not doing this unless it's really, really unavoidable. And we've tried every other diplomatic and economic option, and not doing these sorts of things with a small coalition. We have to do it with a large number of allies. And that means political consultations, not just military coordination.
All right, Colonel Outsen, thank you so much for joining us. The limits of power, I guess, and that is starting to be seen. A war for the right reasons or a war for the wrong reasons. Very difficult to win these wars. And I guess perhaps Vladimir Putin is going to find that out in Ukraine, because the losses that he's taking out there in the war that he's launched out there, how long is that going to sustain? How many losses are they going to be willing to take out there? I guess that is really fundamentally a question.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, I see these wars, the Russian war in Ukraine and the American war in Iraq, as mirror images in the moral sense, in that what we did was a bad thing for an aspiration that was good, even though we through errors of execution and errors in judgment at the very outset, we sort of guaranteed it would not be successful. The Russians are learning that this war of choice is costing them way more than they had anticipated, but I think that their reasons are nakedly ambitious, right? They want to seize part of a sovereign country and annex it to their own, and they want to erase and deny Ukrainian statehood and nationality. That was never our goal in Iraq. We just thought we could improve Iraq by doing what we did. It seems ironic to look back at that.
Right. You're saying, of course, that both of them are the wars of choice, and that is something that to be kept in mind, because wars of choice also rarely go well. Another important lesson for us to keep in mind. Thank you so much, Colonel Alson. Thank you so much for joining us.
I think that's exactly right. And it's tempting when you have great power, great military power. And let's face it, the Russians were on sort of a roll, having had some success in Syria and in bullying Georgia and some other countries like that. So they overestimated their strength. And when you overestimate your own strength and you're internationally not on solid ground with allies, and the majority of the world does view this as a bad war, when you do that, even if you think you have military advantage, it's probably not going to turn out the way that you intended.
All right, Colonel Alson, thank you so much for joining us on this particular program. And that was This World This Week. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll be back again next week. Bye for now.